Would you please pray with me? O Holy One, may the words of my mouth and may the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. And please, O God, let your Spirit speak to us. Let your Spirit speak through us, and let your Spirit speak ever in spite of us. In Jesus' name, amen. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson went on a camping trip. They pitched their tents and shared a meal by the campfire before bunking down for the night. Hours later, Holmes nudges Watson awake and says, "Watson, look up and tell me what you see." Groggily, Watson replies, "I see a fantastic panorama of stars." "And what does that tell you?" Watson ponders for a moment. "Astronomically, it tells me that there are millions of galaxies and potentially billions of planets. Astrologically, I observe that Saturn is in Leo. Horologically, I deduce that the time is approximately 3:15. Theologically, I can see that God is all-powerful and that we are small and insignificant. Hey, Mr. Holmes, when you look up, what do you see?" Holmes is silent for a moment and then replies, "I see that someone has stolen our tent."
Oops.
Matter of perspective. What's it take for us to see? In the story of the man born blind, we can see a lot. And we can miss a lot. Now, some have seen the Gospel of John as justification for anti-Semitism based on the negative references to the Jews. But those folks aren't looking with the right perspective. They need to view John's Gospel through a different lens, and that needs to be the lens of history. And this is where a bit of sex education comes into play. Do I have your attention? As you recall, a sect is a religious group that is a smaller part of a larger group and whose members all share similar beliefs, according to Merriam-Webster. And when the Gospel of John was written in the late 1st century, there happened to be a lot of Jewish sects. And as a result, there was a lot of intra-Jewish conflict between the various Jewish sects. Now, you gotta figure that aside from Pontius Pilate and the Roman centurion, everyone else mentioned in the gospel, or in this gospel in particular, would have been Jewish. So it doesn't make sense to see this passage as validation for anti-Semitism. And in John's gospel, the main conflicts were between the Jewish Christians, kind of weird to hear that, but that's where we think of the disciples. And then we think of the synagogue-based Judaism, which is really the precursor to today's Judaism. So think Pharisees, as well as rabbis and all that good stuff, and synagogue versus temple. So what's the difference between these two? Well, it really boils down to just how they see things a little differently. In many ways, it's like the difference between the Catholics and the followers of Luther. As we know, in this lovely 500th anniversary of the Reformation, Martin Luther did not set out to start his own sect of Christianity. All he wanted to do was reform the status quo. And that's the difference here. When John speaks of the Jews, he's merely referring to the Jewish authorities of the time in a way to distinguish between the two groups or sects. Hence, today's quick foray into sex education. And now that we see this passage isn't about anti-Semitism, let's look and see what it really is about. Now, before we read the gospel lesson from the 9th chapter of John, I invited you to see yourselves in this story. I want you to think back and ask yourselves, with whom did I identify? Perhaps you see yourself in the man born blind. Maybe you know what it's like to be invisible in society. Or worse, to be seen only by your circumstances and then judged as flawed, as broken, as useless, or as less than. Perhaps you see yourself in the disciples. Maybe you identify with those who are trying to follow Jesus and trying to make sense of the world, but get caught up in that whole cause and effect argument. Maybe you find yourself noticing injustice, but aren't quite sure about what to do with it. And so you wrestle with the big questions, but you don't do anything about them because that's where the momentum stops. Perhaps you see yourself in the parents of the man born blind. Maybe you resonate with the guilt that comes from being a parent who's unable to protect your child from a cruel world. Maybe you find yourself trying to fly under the radar as well in the hopes of not being judged a failure and fearing that you'll lose your place in your faith community. Perhaps you see yourself in the Pharisees. Maybe you feel akin to those who are working so hard to preserve the tradition of the faith. And maybe you find a connection with those who see that change is afoot and are frightened of its implications. After all, your job is to keep things together in a world that's falling apart and to be the voice of faith in an increasingly faithless society. Now, the beauty of this passage is that Jesus identifies with each person and each group in the story because he's got what it takes to see, to really see. And he sees each of them just as they are, flawed, yet beloved children of God. And get this, Jesus sees each of us just as we are, flawed, yet beloved children of God who are struggling to make sense of a world that simply makes no sense. Now, this story is about way more than one blind person receiving sight. This story is about all of us who struggle with our own eye problems. Not I as in sight, I as in heart, I as in self, the ego. This story is about what it takes for us to see beyond ourselves and to see, and really see, those with whom we share that struggle of life. So what does it take for us to see? Now, Jesus and his disciples are in Jerusalem for Sukkot, the festival of the booths. I hope you heard that right. Not booze. Booths, like tents or huts. As they're in town for this, the festival of the booths was a celebration of the harvest, and this is why the tents were used, it was a time of reflection on those 40 years that the Israelites spent in the wilderness looking for the promised land. If you stumble across a Jewish community today during the festival of Sukkot, you'll see tents set up in their front yards or backyards. Sometimes they'll hang out, maybe even sleep in them. So as the disciples are wandering the streets of Jerusalem with Jesus, they see a man who was born blind. And at this point, it would have been fitting for them to make the connection between the festival they were attending and the man who was wandering through his own wilderness of blindness. I mean, after all, wouldn't you think they'd make that connection? But they don't. And instead they ask, hey, Rabbi, who sinned? this man or his parents, that he was born blind. When the disciples looked for cause and effect, Jesus shut him down immediately. Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind. And that had to be hard for the disciples to hear, because the common wisdom of the day was that afflictions were the direct result of sin, either your sin or your parents' sin. But Jesus contradicts this notion because, I need you to hear this, sometimes things just happen. And sometimes things don't happen. God doesn't sit around all day keeping tracks of the infractions in order to strike us down with some sort of hardship. Rather, God works through the bad to help us find the good. So, if the disciples were perplexed by Jesus' answer, imagine how this must have sounded to the man born blind. While the man's hearing was just fine, no one asks him what he thinks. And instead, Jesus does something both remarkable and disgusting. Without saying a word, he spits on the ground. And then he makes a paste of mud and smears it on the dumbfounded man's eyes and tells him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam." Well, what's a guy going to do with mud in his eyes? What else can he do other than make his way to the pool of Siloam to follow that spitting stranger's command? And as he washes his eyes, he experiences something he just can't explain. Because for the very first time in his life, he sees. Can you imagine seeing light for the first time? Or the face of a loved one for the first time? As a result, the man's life is completely transformed. And it's transformed to the point that folks can't or won't recognize him apart from his blindness. And at this point, the story gets downright comical, because this community starts debating whether or not the now-sighted man is the same man who blindly begged on the streets. And it's funny because he keeps saying, "Yep, that's me. I'm the man." But they can't hear him because they won't hear him. They can't see him as a person because they can only see what they expect to see, which is a nameless blind beggar. Can you imagine his frustration at hearing arguments about him that refused to include him? The man who was physically blind can now see. So what's it going to take for those around him to see him with new eyes? Well, it's going to take a lot, it seems. When Jesus healed the man, he set off a chain reaction of questions. The folks who were arguing over his identity asked, "How were your eyes opened?" The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and told me to go to Siloam to wash. I did what he said, and now I see. Where is this man? How should I know? I've never seen him before in my life. Get it? I've never seen him before in my life. Not satisfied, those folks brought the man before the Pharisees, those religious experts, to see what they thought of it all. And, of course, there were more questions. And as all good church groups are apt to do, they got caught up so much in staring at the teeny tiny things, like healing on the Sabbath, that they couldn't see the big picture. A man born blind had just received his sight. Now, it would be like a church member having a vision for a mission. Say the vision is to start an after-school program at the church. And so she starts the program, and it's a success. There are kids with a safe place to go after school. Generations are working together. What could possibly go wrong? Absolutely nothing. Nothing until the well-meaning church leaders start to helpfully get involved. And rather than focusing on the big picture, they focus on themselves. How does this program bring us new members or better stewardship? How will this program affect our budget? Who's going to pay for our extra heating and cleaning bills? What's going to happen to our carpet in the fellowship hall? What's our liability? Pretty soon, the vision is lost. The program shuts down, and folks wonder why and how such a terrific ministry could have died such a quick and terrible death. The Pharisees react in a similar way, because instead of seeing the miracle before them, they want to look at it under a microscope. They want to dissect it into something they can see and understand and control. It's not that the Pharisees are bad people. No, they're not. They are good folk who are trying their darndest to take care of their faith community and to guard it and to preserve it. But they can't see what they're doing. They can't see that by holding on so tightly to traditions such as it's a sin to heal on the Sabbath, that they're squeezing the place for God working miracles right out of their midst. Like all faith communities who struggle with their identities in a shifting landscape, they become desperate. And they start by questioning the man's parents, again treating the guy like he's a non-person the way the others did when they talk about him and not to him. And then they go after the man. They keep questioning him and hounding him about his healing and about Jesus, his healer. And eventually, the Pharisees, out of frustration, they excommunicate him. They kick the poor guy out. Here he is. He spent a lifetime marginalized in the darkness and was looking forward to finally being welcomed into the community. And now he's kicked out because they can't see him as a miracle to be celebrated. They can only see him as a mystery to be solved. And so rather than wrestling with the mystery, they remove him from the community. But not before the man they were interrogating says to them, "Look, there's a lot I don't know. But one thing I do know is that though I was blind, now I see. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." That's a powerful verse. And while it takes a lifetime for some to learn how to see, others are lucky enough or blessed enough to figure this out sooner than later. Now, we know what it took the blind man to see. But what does it take for us to see? Does it take a life-changing event, either a miraculous healing or a mysterious malady? Does it take being at a crossroads, personally or professionally? Does it take putting aside our eye problems and our self-absorption so that we can then finally and truly see the face of God in others? Does it take simply sitting still and noticing how many things in the world can be seen differently depending on our perspectives? Maybe it takes all of them. Or maybe it takes none of them. What does it take for us to see? What does it take for you to see? Though I was blind, now I see. With these 7 little words, we're invited to imagine a whole new reality, one where we experience a transformation like none other. A man named John Newton experienced such a transformation, so much that he included these very words from John 9:25 in the first verse of Amazing Grace. Now, Newton had quite an adventuresome life before settling down to write hymns. He suffered tragedy at an early age, and by the time the guy was 11, he was orphaned, and he was working on a ship trying to make a living. Eventually, the guy ended up being a slave trader. And then, during a fierce storm at sea, John Newton had a come-to-Jesus moment. And he spent the rest of his life learning how to see the world through Jesus' eyes. And as he turned his life around, he gave up human trafficking and became both an outspoken abolitionist and a dedicated Anglican priest. And here's even more trivia for you. Did you know that Amazing Grace can be sung to a variety of tunes? Were you aware of this? For instance, those from the South may be happy to hear that Amazing Grace may be sung to the Yellow Rose of Texas. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Next time, you can think of that. For the Bob Dylan fans, there's always House of the Rising Sun. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. He would not be that flat. That saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. And then those who favor retro TV may be pleased to find out that Amazing Grace can be sung to the theme from Gilligan's Island. Did you know this? Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. Was blind, but now I see. And finally, for the young and young at heart, there's always the Mickey Mouse Club theme. Maybe you want to join me. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, now am found, blind, but now I see. Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ. No. The beauty of it is that it's as if all the words of this song were meant for all of God's people, regardless of the tune one is called to sing. Just as the man born blind had a story to tell, and just as John Newton had a song to sing, each of us probably has our own moments. I wouldn't even say probably. Each of us definitely have had our own moments of revelation when we saw life through new eyes. Maybe the eyes in our heads, maybe the eyes in our hearts, maybe the eyes in our minds. But more than that, we saw through the new eyes that are Christ's eyes, which begs the question, where in your life have you been blind? What did it take for you to see? And what will it take for you to share your own story and your own song of God's amazing grace at work in your life? Amen.